Imagine for a second that you're standing right in the center of a medieval market square in Germany.
Okay, I am picturing it.
So it is early evening. The cobblestones beneath your feet are super uneven, just worn down by centuries of foot traffic.
Oh, yeah. And the air is crisp. Maybe you can smell like roasted almonds or even just the damp sandstone of this massive Gothic church towering right in front of you.
Exactly. And you've got these intricate half-timbered houses kind of leaning in from the edges of the square.
It sounds incredibly grounded, almost idyllic, really.
Right. I mean, if you were standing on this exact spot in the early 1500s, you might have literally bumped shoulders with a Renaissance genius,
Yeah.
a man who was observing the world with such intense precision that he was about to completely redefine European art.
Albrecht Durer.
Yeah, but okay, hold that image in your head because we have to flip the channel.
Okay.
If you fast forward a few centuries and you stand on that very same ground, the atmosphere violently shifts.
It really does.
The smell of the market is just gone. The sky is pierced by these blinding searchlights, and the sound of everyday commerce is completely drowned out by the terrifying, synchronized sound of millions of boots marching in lockstep to fascism.
It's the absolute definition of a historical paradox, isn't it?
It really is. I mean, as humans, we naturally want to categorize places. We want to define a city by, a single era or a single vibe.
Right, we want a simple narrative. But here you have the ultimate collision of human brilliance and human depravity occupying the exact same physical space.
And that tension, that crazy contradiction, is exactly why we are here today. Welcome to this deep dive into the source material.
Glad to be here.
Today's mission is to unpack the incredibly complex, often kind of dizzying story of Nuremberg.
Because we are looking at a city that lived through this incredible golden age as a fiercely independent imperial free city, right? Wow. It nurtured the revolutionary mind of Albrecht Durer.
Yeah. And then, in a twist that feels almost too dark for fiction, it becomes the massive theatrical stage for Nazi rallies, and ultimately the Nuremberg trials.
And our goal for this deep dive is to look past just the timeline. We're just going to read a list of events that randomly happen to share a zip code.
No, we are looking at the connective tissue. We have to ask the hard question, why this specific city?
Exactly. How does a proud, highly artistic, deeply intellectual city become the deliberate chosen stage for both the Third Reich's most terrifying glories and its ultimate crushing judgment?
To really understand how this happens, we have to start at the foundation. And I mean the literal geological foundation.
The rock.
The rock. Because when you look at the origins of Nuremberg, it doesn't just organically grow from a sleepy farming village on a riverbank. The sources point out that it starts quite literally on a big rock.
Yes, a massive sandstone elevation. I mean, the very name of the city, Nuremberg, translates in Old High German to Rocky Mountain or Rocky Hill.
Which makes sense.
Right. And the first time this place even enters the written historical record is in the year 1050. We have this document called the Sigina Charter.
This is such a great specific historical moment. Can you set the scene for us? What actually is the Sigina Charter?
So it's 1050. Emperor Heinrich III is traveling through the region holding court, and he issues this charter to officially free a local bondswoman, a servant, basically named Sigina.
Okay.
But for historians, the most crucial part of this document isn't just the freeing of Sigina, it's where the emperor physically was when he signed it.
Right, he was camped at the foot of this prominent rocky hill.
Precisely. Because at the time, Central Europe was governed by these early medieval royal families, specifically the Salian and later the Hohenstaufen dynasties.
And they were trying to consolidate power, right, in a very fractured landscape.
Exactly. It was highly decentralized. They needed secure routes to move their armies and their wealth around. So they look at this giant sandstone rock and realize, wow, this is the perfect strategic vantage point.
So you can see for miles.
Right. So they decide to build a massive imperial castle, the Kaiserberg, right on top of it.
So the city is essentially born as a military and administrative fortress.
Yes, a stronghold.
But it doesn't stay a military outpost for long. It evolves into an absolute economic powerhouse.
Oh, a massive one.
I was reading through the sources, and the way the city's economy explodes, it almost reminded me of a corporate spinoff that becomes vastly more successful than the parent company that originally funded it.
That's actually a highly accurate way to look at it.
Yeah.
Because when the emperor built the castle, he couldn't be there all the time, right? He had an entire empire to run.
He's a busy guy.
Right, so he installed local administrators, the burgraves, specifically the Counts of Zollern, to manage the castle and the surrounding settlement while he was gone.
But meanwhile, a civilian population of merchants and craftsmen is, growing at the base of the hill.
And those merchants hit the geographic jackpot. I mean, geography is destiny in the Middle Ages.
Oh, for sure.
And Nuremberg happens to sit perfectly at the intersection of vital long-distance trade highways.
Right. You've got routes coming up from the wealthy, Renaissance-fueled city-states of Italy.
Yes. Crossing the Alps and heading north toward the bustling Hanseatic ports on the Baltic Sea. Spices, silks, timber, metals, it all flows through this one specific point.
So Nuremberg quickly becomes a massive transit hub and a sophisticated financial marketplace.
It earns the nickname the Warehouse of Europe.
The warehouse of Europe. I love that. So you have this merchant class getting incredibly wealthy, incredibly fast.
And historically, whenever a middle class gets a massive influx of wealth, they start wanting political power to match it.
Naturally, they start looking up at the castle, looking at the burgraves, taking a cut of their profits, and they think, why are we answering to these middle management nobles?
Exactly. They want to cut out the middleman. They want to deal directly with the CEO, the emperor.
And they actually get their wish in a spectacular way in the year 1219.
Yes, Emperor Friedrich II issues a document called the Great Freedom Letter, the Großen Freiheitsbrief.
This feels like the moment Nuremberg truly becomes Nuremberg. What did this letter actually do?
It was a massive transfer of power. It officially removed the city from the jurisdiction of those local burgraves. Nuremberg was granted the status of a free imperial city.
Which is a huge deal.
Massive.
Yeah.
In the complex legal web of the Holy Roman Empire, this concept was called imperial immediacy, or Reichsfreiheit.
Meaning they answered to no one but the emperor himself.
Correct. They were basically their own sovereign nation-state, just nested within the empire. Think about the practical implications of that freedom for a second.
Right, like what did they actually get to do?
Well, they gained the right to mint their own independent currency. They set their own customs duties and taxation policies.
Yeah.
They built their own massive defensive city walls without needing some lord's permission. And they formed their own city council to govern themselves. This level of autonomy was incredibly rare and incredibly lucrative.
So they are rich, they are self-governing, and they are basically untouchable by local warlords. But what's fascinating to me is that they weren't just this rogue, independent trading post operating in the shadows. They tied themselves deeply, symbolically, to the emperor. They became the center of the political universe in 1356.
Yes, this is a crucial pivot point in European history.
Yeah.
In 1356, Emperor Charles V issued something called the Golden Bull.
And the Holy Roman Empire was famously decentralized, right? It wasn't like France or England with a clear line of success.
Oh, not at all. Kings were elected by a group of prince-electors, which often led to complete chaos, bribery, and civil wars. The Golden Bull was Charles V's attempt to write a foundational constitutional law to standardize how the empire actually operated.
It was the bedrock of imperial law for the next 400 years.
It was.
And buried within this constitutional decree, Charles V mandates a very specific rule regarding Nuremberg. He declares that every newly elected German king must hold his very first imperial diet, his first official parliament or assembly, right there in Nuremberg.
It is really hard to overstate how significant this mandate was.
I really want to pause on this because this completely blew my mind when I read the sources.
Right.
It wasn't just that Nuremberg had nice hotels and a good conference center. It was literally the legally mandated constitutional inaugural stage for the most powerful men in Europe.
Yes.
Like, if you won the election, you had to come to Nuremberg to officially kick off your reign and prove your legitimacy.
You had to. The Golden Bull elevated Nuremberg to a holy trinity of imperial cities.
Okay, who are the other two?
You had Frankfurt, where the kings were elected. You had Aachen, where they were crowned, connecting them to the legacy of Charlemagne. And you had Nuremberg, where they essentially held their first real session of government, where the business of ruling actually began.
And an imperial diet wasn't just a weekend retreat, right? This was an incredibly lavish, massive logistical undertaking.
Oh, there was a traveling circus of power. When the emperor arrived, he brought his entire court. Yeah. Hundreds of nobles, knights, diplomats, and clergy.
It's just a massive influx of people.
The population of the city would practically double. The pageantry was immense. And of course, the economic injection into the city's taverns, craftsmen, and merchants was just staggering.
It must have been insane for the local economy.
Emperor Charles IV loved the city so much that he stayed within its walls 52 times during his reign. The city became the ultimate physical theater of imperial power.
And they doubled down on this theater in 1423. Emperor Sigismund decides to entrust Nuremberg with something incredibly precious. He gives the city permanent custody of the Imperial Regalia, the Reichskleinodium.
Yes, the physical, tangible symbols of the empire's divine and earthly authority.
We're talking about the crown jewels, basically.
Exactly. The imperial crown, the royal scepter, the orb, the ceremonial swords, and holy relics, too, including what was believed to be the holy lance that pierced the side of Christ.
So by physically holding these objects, Nuremberg isn't just a wealthy city anymore. It effectively becomes the unofficial capital and the sacred treasury of the Holy Roman Empire.
And we must remember, the Holy Roman Empire was considered the First Reich. So Nuremberg was saturated, deeply, thoroughly saturated, in the mythology, the legitimate authority, and the historical continuity of the German nation.
It was widely considered the most distinguished, best-located city of the realm.
Without a doubt.
Okay, so we have the stage completely set. We have a city dripping in unprecedented wealth. We have a population that is highly educated, intensely self-governing, and fiercely independent.
And they are physically sitting on the symbolic heart of the empire.
Right. So when you mix all those ingredients together, you get an absolute cultural explosion. The city transitions from just being a political powerhouse to being the intellectual engine of Europe.
It is a textbook historical example of how massive economic surplus and civic freedom fuel artistic and scientific revolutions.
It makes total sense.
By the late 15th century, Nuremberg's economy is really evolving. They aren't just moving raw materials or simple trade goods anymore. They are taking their wealth and investing it in what we would today call high-tech intellectual property.
And let's be clear about what high-tech means in the 1400s, because it's pretty amazing.
It is.
We are talking about precision mechanics that were altering how humanity understood time and space. There's this guy named Peter Henlein working in Nuremberg, and he invents one of the very first portable pocket watches.
Which is a huge leap.
Yeah, for the first time, time isn't just a bell ringing in a church tower. It's something an individual can carry in their coat.
The miniaturization of mechanics required extraordinary skill, and simultaneously, they are mapping the universe. Martin Behaim, another Nuremberg native, creates the Erdapfel, literally the Earth Apple, in 1492.
Love that name.
He was the oldest surviving terrestrial globe in the world.
Though it famously doesn't have the Americas on it, right? Because Columbus was literally sailing across the ocean the exact same year Behaim was painting the globe.
Exactly. It represented the absolute cutting edge of geographical knowledge right up to the second before the world expanded.
But of all the high-tech industries flourishing in Nuremberg, nothing was more consequential than the printing press.
The printing press was the internet of the Renaissance,
Mm-hmm.
and Nuremberg became Silicon Valley.
That is the perfect way to look at it. And it is into this hyper-innovative, wealthy, fiercely independent, print-obsessed city that Albrecht Durer is born in 1471.
And Durer is just an endlessly fascinating figure. He isn't born into royalty, he is born into craftsmanship. His father is a highly successful goldsmith.
So from a very young age, Durer is in a workshop learning intricate metalwork.
We have to think about what goldsmithing actually teaches a young mind. It trains the eye to see microscopic detail. It trains the hand to work with unforgiving materials.
Right, because if you mess up gold, that's a big problem.
Exactly. If you make a mistake while engraving gold, you ruin an incredibly expensive piece of inventory. It demands an agonizing level of precision and patience.
So he has this foundational hardware of precision, and he is also completely surrounded by the new media landscape.
Yes.
His own godfather is a man named Anton Koberger. And Koberger isn't just a guy with a press in his basement. He is essentially a media mogul.
He runs one of the largest printing operations in all of Europe. He has 24 presses running constantly, 100 workers. And in 1493, he publishes the massive Nuremberg Chronicle.
The Nuremberg Chronicle was a behemoth of a book, an encyclopedia of world history packed with hundreds of detailed woodcut illustrations.
Durer is breathing in this atmosphere of mass communication, early capitalism, and reproducible art from day one. He sees that images don't just belong on the walls of a cathedral. They can be printed, bound, and shipped across the continent.
But Durer doesn't just want to be a local craftsman. Initially, he trains in the traditional Northern European Gothic style under a local master named Michael Wolgmet.
And the Northern Gothic style is very distinct. If you look at artists from that region and era, their work is characterized by an intense, sometimes harsh realism.
It's very striking.
It is deeply emotional, heavily focused on suffering, and possesses an almost obsessive attention to tiny atmospheric details. The texture of fur, the reflection in a tiny mirror, the wrinkles on a face.
That it often lacked a structural mathematical understanding of space.
Right. Precisely. And Durer is clearly restless. He knows there is more out there. So he embarks on his Wanderjahr, the traditional gap years that young journeymen took to travel, work, and learn from other masters.
But Durer doesn't just travel to the next town over. He crosses the Alps. He goes down into Italy. Twice.
And Italy, in the late 1490s and early 1500s, is ground zero for the Renaissance.
He goes to Venice, right, so he is suddenly swimming in completely different artistic waters.
He's exposed to a completely alien philosophy of art. Up north, art was largely considered a mechanical craft. Down in Venice, he meets artists like Giovanni Bellini, who are revered almost like philosophers.
Wow, quite the shift.
Oh, definitely. Durer is suddenly exposed to the Italian obsession with classical antiquity, derived from the Greeks and Romans. He learns about geometric perspective, the mathematical plotting of receding space on a flat surface.
He studies idealized human anatomy based on actual dissection and classical proportions. These were concepts that simply weren't being taught in the workshops of Nuremberg.
This is where Durer's genius truly crystallizes.
I was trying to think of how to describe what he did based on the sources. It's almost like he discovered a completely new vocabulary of mathematics and humanism in Italy.
Yeah.
But instead of abandoning his native tongue, he fused them together. He took the structural engineering of the Italian Renaissance, the math, the perfect anatomy, and he married it to the hyper-detailed emotional craftsmanship of his Northern Gothic roots.
He created a revolutionary visual synthesis. He proved that Northern artists didn't have to choose between emotional detail and mathematical perfection. They could master both.
Right.
But what makes Durer a historical superstar, the reason we were talking about him centuries later, isn't just what he made in his studio, it is how he distributed it to the world.
Right. Because before Durer, let's say you are a brilliant painter in Germany. A wealthy duke or a bishop hires you to paint a massive altarpiece.
Oh.
You spend 6 months on it, it gets hung in a private chapel or a local church, and that's it. Only the people who physically walk into that specific building will ever see your masterpiece.
The audience is profoundly limited by geography. Durer looks at the printing presses humming in his godfather's shop and realizes that a completely different business model is possible. He realizes that the press is an engine for democratization.
He pivots hard into printmaking. He creates woodcuts and, more importantly, copper engravings. Let's talk about the mechanics of this, because it is staggering. He isn't painting with a brush.
No, he is using a specialized steel cutting tool called a burin.
What exactly is that?
A burin has a highly sharpened V-shaped tip. The artist has to push it into a solid plate of copper to carve a microscopic groove. The physical resistance of the metal is immense.
I can only imagine.
You have to push hard enough to carve the metal, but if your hand slips by a millimeter, you gouge the plate, and the entire piece is ruined.
And Durer takes this technique to a level that still baffles experts today. He uses a method called cross-hatching carving, thousands of intersecting parallel lines.
It's incredibly painstaking.
He creates gradients, textures, shadows, and muscles. He achieves this effect called chiaroscuro, which is the dramatic, theatrical contrast between intense light and deep, pitch-black shadow. And he's doing all of this illusion with nothing but black ink pressed onto white paper.
Right, there is no gray ink.
Exactly. The gray is just an optical illusion created by how densely he packs these microscopic carved lines together.
The technical brilliance is undeniable, but the business strategy is what changed the world. Once he had carved that master plate, he could ink it and run it through a press hundreds, even thousands of times.
It's essentially early mass production.
Exactly. These prints were highly portable. They didn't require a wall. They could be held in a traveler's saddlebag. They were relatively cheap, meaning middle-class merchants could afford them, not just kings. Durer could ship his genius across the entire continent.
In 1498, he publishes The Apocalypse, a series of 15 massive, terrifying, incredibly detailed woodcuts illustrating the Book of Revelation. It becomes a massive, continent-wide blockbuster. It essentially goes viral.
And with that fame comes a fascinating psychological shift. We see Durer develop an intense focus on what we would modernly call personal branding.
Personal branding in the 1500s.
Yeah. Remember, in Northern Europe at this time, artists were still largely viewed as anonymous craftsmen. You didn't sign a chair you built, and you didn't always sign a painting.
Durer completely rejects that. He envisions the artist as a divinely inspired intellectual, a genius whose individual identity matters. So what does he do? He boldly stamps his work with an iconic monogram, a large capital A with a smaller D nested inside it.
It is arguably one of the first recognizable logos in corporate history. It was a bold public assertion of individual authorship and intellectual property.
He was declaring to the world, I, Albrecht Durer of Nuremberg, conceived this with my mind and executed it with my hand. This is my unique individual vision.
He was so protective of this that he actually took legal action in Venice against artists who were copying his monogram to sell counterfeit prints.
Let's look at a specific masterpiece that proves the synthesis of Italian math, northern detail, and fierce individualism. His 1504 copper engraving, Adam and Eve.
Adam and Eve is a masterclass, a manifesto of his entire philosophy.
Uh,
If you look at the figures of Adam and Eve, they are depicted in the contrapposto pose.
Right, that classic weight-shifting stance, one knee slightly bent, hips tilted, that ancient Greek sculptors used to show a body in motion.
Yes, they represent the idealized, mathematically perfect human form, straight out of the Italian playbook.
But they aren't standing in some abstract, sunny Italian plaza. The background is a dense, terrifying, highly detailed, dark German forest. The bark on the trees looks real enough to scrape your knuckles, and the forest is populated by these incredibly specific, symbolic animals.
Yes, the elk, the ox, the rabbit, and the cat. These animals represented the four humors, the bodily fluids that medieval medicine believed governed human temperament.
Oh, wow.
Durer is showing the precise moment before the fall of man, when human anatomy was perfect and the humors were in perfect balance. It is a profound philosophical inquiry, executed through agonizingly precise metalwork.
He elevated printmaking from a simple illustration to high art. And this brings us to another huge aspect of his life, which is his relationship with religion.
It's unavoidable in this era.
Because the tectonic plates of European faith are shifting under his feet. In 1517, Martin Luther sparks the Protestant Reformation, and Nuremberg, being fiercely independent and deeply literate, embraces it. In 1525, it becomes the first free imperial city to officially adopt Protestantism.
Durer is deeply moved by Luther's ideas. He reads Luther's writings, and he fundamentally agrees with the core tenet of the Reformation. He actually converts to Protestantism.
And we can see this massive shift in his worldview manifested in his art. In 1526, near the end of his life, he creates a massive two-panel painting called The Four Apostles.
And what's interesting is that no one commissioned this. No church asked for it. He painted it on his own dime and gifted it to the city council of Nuremberg to hang in the town hall.
Which means he had absolute freedom to paint exactly what he believed.
Exactly. If we look closely at the Four Apostles, it is widely considered a visual manifesto of the Protestant Reformation. In the two panels, you have four figures. On the left panel, he places John in the foreground, dominating the space. John is holding an open Bible, and he is actively reading it.
And lurking behind John, almost pushed into the shadows, is Peter.
This is the crucial detail. In Catholic tradition, Peter is the rock upon which the church is built. He is the first pope, the ultimate symbol of the church's institutional, hierarchical authority.
Right.
He holds the keys to heaven.
Right.
By physically prioritizing John the Apostle associated with the text over Peter, Durer is visually illustrating Martin Luther's core belief.
That salvation comes solely through the individual's direct personal engagement with the scripture. It doesn't require a priest, a pope, or a hierarchy to act as a middleman.
It is the ultimate elevation of the individual's intellect and soul. The individual has a direct line to the divine, and Durer takes this democratization of knowledge even further in his final years.
What does he do?
He actually stops painting as much and dedicates himself to writing educational treatises. He writes the 4 books on human proportion and manuals on geometry and measurement.
And crucially, he does not write them in Latin.
Right. Latin was the language of the elite, the academics, and the Catholic Church. If you wrote in Latin, you were locking the knowledge in a vault. Durer writes his treatises in vernacular German.
He wanted to make advanced mathematical, artistic, and scientific knowledge accessible to the everyday craftsmen of Nuremberg, the carpenters, the stonemasons, the young goldsmiths.
It's incredible. To summarize his impact, Durer embodied the absolute zenith of the Northern humanist ideal. He transformed the artist from a nameless manual laborer into an educated, respected intellectual creator. He fundamentally cemented the concept of individual intellect, personal autonomy, and individual accountability in the European consciousness.
Okay, so keeping that immense legacy of individualism in mind, We arrive at the most jarring, difficult transition in our deep dive. We are entering Act 3, The Dark Mirror.
It's a tough pivot.
I really struggled with this while reading the sources. How does a city defined by free trade, civic independence, scientific inquiry, and Durer's fierce championing of the individual intellect, how does that city become the ultimate, terrifying theater for fascist, mindless conformity?
It is a profound tragedy, and it is a textbook case of historical hijacking. The National Socialists, under Adolf Hitler, did not select Nuremberg out of a hat. It was not a logistical accident.
No, it's very intentional.
It was a highly calculated, deeply strategic choice. They executed a massive municipal identity theft. They deliberately co-opted Nuremberg's rich, Golden Age legacy to legitimize a radical, terrifying new regime.
Now, practically speaking, there were some logistical reasons. The Nazis had a very strong early political base there in the 1920s. The regional party leader, the Gauleiter, was a man named Julius Streicher.
Streicher was one of the most viciously anti-Semitic figures in the entire party. He published the notorious propaganda newspaper Der Stürmer, right there in Nuremberg.
And the local police chief was also an early sympathizer, right?
Yeah, so practically, the Nazis knew they could hold massive rallies without local political interference. It was friendly territory.
But the sources make it clear that the practical reasons were secondary to the symbolic reasons. Hitler was obsessed with history, or rather, with twisting history to serve his narrative.
He wanted to visually and emotionally fuse the glory of the First Reich, the Holy Roman Empire that we talked about earlier, with his newly proclaimed Third Reich.
Think about the optics. When Hitler stood on a podium in Nuremberg, he was physically surrounded by the medieval castle walls, the Gothic churches, the cobblestones, and the ghost of Albrecht Durer.
He was standing in the city that used to hold the Imperial Regalia. He was sending a very deliberate subconscious message to the German people. He was saying, "We are not a radical aberration. We are the logical, inevitable, historical continuation of ancient German greatness."
They literally marketed Nuremberg as the most German of German cities. They made a massive propaganda push, claiming they were evolving the city from its democratic era, from the city of the Reichstag to the city of the Reich Party rallies.
The irony is sickening.
But wait, hold on. This is where I have to push back on the history because I'm struggling to connect these two philosophies. We just spent 20 minutes discussing how Durer was the ultimate champion of the individual. He put his personal logo on everything. He believed in the autonomy of the human mind.
Right.
How on earth did the Nazis, a regime fundamentally obsessed with crushing individualism and demanding absolute obedience to the state, justify using his city as their spiritual headquarters?
It is an excellent question, and the answer is deeply insidious. They didn't reconcile Durer's philosophy with their own. They completely inverted it.
Wow.
They kept the aesthetic of the city, but hollowed out its soul. To understand this, we have to look at the Nazi architectural philosophy, which was driven largely by Hitler's chief architect, Albert Speer.
Speer's architectural doctrine was based on two concepts, perpetuity and monumentality, right?
Yes, Durer's art celebrated the human scale. It was about the precise details of a single human face, the mathematical proportion of a single body, the autonomy of a single mind.
And Speer's stuff was the opposite.
Speer's architecture was designed specifically to dwarf the human being. It was engineered to make the individual feel entirely insignificant, tiny, and powerless compared to the eternal crushing scale of the state.
Let's talk about that architecture of de-individualization, because the sheer scale of what they built in Nuremberg is hard to even comprehend. From 1933 to 1938, they construct the massive Nazi Party rally grounds just outside the medieval city center around the Dutzenteich Lake.
Where they build the Luitpold Arena, the Congress Hall, and the centerpiece, the Zeppelin Field.
The Zeppelin Field is a staggering structure. The interior area of the field alone was 312 by 285 meters. That is larger than 12 standard soccer fields stitched together. It was designed to hold up to 200,000 people at once.
Speer designed massive, imposing grandstands built out of heavy pink and white granite.
And it was topped with this endless colonnade, right?
Yes, specifically influenced by the ancient Pergamon altar. It was classical architecture stripped of its humanity, made rigid and terrifying. It wasn't built for acoustics, and it wasn't built for human comfort. It was a brutalist stage set designed to project absolute, unyielding power.
And the architecture wasn't just physical stone, it was also made of light. Speer created what became known as the Cathedral of Light. The sources describe this, and honestly, the mechanics of it are as brilliant as they are evil.
He took 130 heavy military anti-aircraft searchlights. These incredibly powerful flak models designed to spot bombers.
He arranged them in a massive rectangle surrounding the entire stadium and pointed their beams straight up into the night sky.
The beams reached 20,000 feet into the air. They merged with the clouds.
It created an immaterial architecture. It literally created glowing, solid-looking walls of light surrounding the hundreds of thousands of men marching below.
The psychological impact of being inside that space cannot be overstated. You are no longer a person. You are a particle trapped inside a glowing temple of the state.
Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, explicitly stated the psychological goal of these rallies. He wasn't hiding it. He said the rallies were designed to change a participant from a little worm into part of a large dragon.
I'm a little worm into part of a large dragon. That quote perfectly encapsulates the annihilation of the individual. They used every theatrical trick in the book to achieve this. They played thunderous, soaring Wagnerian music performed by massive orchestras. They used fireworks, explosive lighting, and endless torchlight processions.
And they had these deeply unsettling, almost pagan rituals. They had a flag called the Blutfahne, the blood banner. It was a swastika flag that had supposedly been soaked in the blood of Nazi martyrs during Hitler's failed beer hall putsch in Munich in 1923.
During the Nuremberg rallies, they would hold a solemn ceremony where new party flags were physically touched to the Blutfahne to somehow magically transfer its mystical power.
It was a cult ritual designed to bypass rational thought entirely. The entire environment, the architecture, the light, the sound, the rituals, was engineered to induce a state of ecstatic, unquestioning surrender.
The aesthetic component was no longer supplied by individual artistic expression, as it was in Durer's time. The art was the synchronized marching masses. Hundreds of thousands of men, dressed identically, moving identically, acting as a single, mindless, terrifying organism.
It was the absolute deliberate destruction of the individual autonomy that the city had once championed.
And the terror is that this wasn't just contained to a field in Nuremberg. They packaged this fabricated hypnotic reality and broadcast it to the entire country.
Right. In 1934, they brought in the filmmaker Leni Riefenstahl to document the rally. She used cutting-edge camera techniques, moving dollies, and aerial shots to create the infamous propaganda film Triumph of the Will.
It is considered one of the most effective and dangerous pieces of propaganda ever made. It was shown in cinemas, in town halls, and in classrooms across Germany. Roughly 70 million Germans were exposed to it.
The goal was to overwhelm the populace with the irresistible aesthetic of power, to make resistance seem not just dangerous, but entirely futile against such a massive unified force.
And we absolutely must confront the horrifying, real-world reality of what this consolidated power was used for. These rallies weren't just pageants. They were political weapons.
Each year's rally had a programmatic title. In 1935, they held what they cynically called the Rally of Freedom.
The horrific irony of that title is almost unbearable in hindsight, because this was the rally where Hitler unexpectedly ordered the entire German parliament, the Reichstag, to physically convene in Nuremberg. He didn't just want them to watch the march, he wanted them to pass legislation.
He had passed the Nuremberg Laws, the Nuremberg race laws. In the exact same city that had pioneered the concept of civic freedom with the Great Freedom Letter of 1219, the Nazis legally, methodically stripped German Jews of their citizenship.
The laws officially defined exactly who was and wasn't considered a Jew based on a cold, bureaucratic calculation of bloodlines and grandparents. It prohibited marriage and relationships between Jews and non-Jews.
It legally exiled an entire population from their own society, laying the bureaucratic and legal foundation for horrific persecution and, eventually, mass murder.
The city of the party rallies, the city of Albrecht Durer, officially became the legislative birthplace of the Holocaust.
Which makes the final chapter of our deep dive both profoundly necessary and deeply, almost cosmically symbolic. We arrive at Act 4, the reckoning, the reassertion of individual accountability.
Fast forward to the spring of 1945. The war in Europe ends. The 1,000-year Reich has collapsed in a mere 12 years, leaving behind tens of millions of dead and a continent in absolute ruins.
And the victorious allies, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union, now face an unprecedented question. What do we do with the captured leadership of the Nazi regime?
And they eventually choose to hold the trials in Nuremberg. But why there? So many major German cities were leveled, Berlin was rubble. Why bring the architects of the regime back to Franconia?
As is often the case in history, it was a mix of intense practical necessity and profound symbolism. Practically, Nuremberg was one of the very few major German cities where a massive judicial complex had miraculously survived the intense Allied bombing campaigns.
The Palace of Justice.
Yes, the Palace of Justice. It was a sprawling complex. It was largely intact. It had dozens of offices for the hundreds of lawyers and translators who would be needed.
And crucially, it had a massive, secure prison immediately attached to it. They could move the most dangerous men in the world from their cells to the courtroom without ever taking them outside.
But reading the sources, it's clear the symbolism was the real driver for the Americans and the British.
Absolutely. The Allies deeply understood the theatrical power of location. They wanted to hold the trials in the very same city where the massive Nazi rallies had mesmerized and hypnotized the German nation.
They wanted to hold them in the city where the Nuremberg Laws had been drafted and passed. There was an immense, deliberate, symbolic value in dragging the architects of these unspeakable atrocities back to their own grand architectural stage, not to celebrate them, but to legally dismantle them.
But getting to a trial, an actual legal proceeding with lawyers and evidence, was not a guarantee. The sources point out a lot of behind-the-scenes friction. As early as the 1943 Moscow Declaration, the Allies had agreed that Nazi leaders would be punished. But how to punish them was fiercely debated.
Winston Churchill, for a significant period, favored simply identifying the top leaders, lining them up against a wall, and executing them without a trial.
And Joseph Stalin, who had lost millions of citizens to Nazi brutality, often agreed with summary execution, sometimes jokingly suggesting they shoot 50,000 officers just to be sure.
It was primarily the Americans, notably led by the Secretary of War Henry Stimson and Supreme Court Justice Robert H. Jackson, who pushed forcefully for a legitimate legal process.
Jackson argued that if it just shot the leaders, it would look like mere vengeance, victor's justice. They needed a trial to officially document the crimes for history so that no one could ever deny what happened.
And that monumental push leads to the 1945 London Agreement and Charter.
The London Charter is, without exaggeration, one of the most important documents in the entire history of international law. It established the framework for the International Military Tribunal, the IMT.
It accomplished something practically impossible. It brought together judges and prosecutors from 4 completely different legal systems: American common law, British common law, French civil law, and Soviet jurisprudence, to conduct a single, unified joint trial.
But here is the massive, seemingly insurmountable legal hurdle they had to overcome, and I need you to explain how they did it. Historically, prior to World War II, international law largely dealt with states. It dealt with countries, not individual people.
Right, if a country went to war and committed atrocities, the state itself might have to surrender territory or pay massive financial reparations if they lost.
That is correct. International law was built to govern the interactions of sovereign nations.
Right, so couldn't the captured Nazi generals and politicians just sit in the courtroom and say, look, I am deeply sorry, but I was an agent of the sovereign state of Germany. I was legally following the orders of my head of state. You can punish Germany, but you cannot punish me as an individual. Couldn't they just hide behind the shield of active state?
This question goes to the very heart of the trials. You have hit on the most critical legal defense the Nazis possessed. And you are right. Before Nuremberg, the beaten path of international law protected individual state actors.
So how did they get around it?
The London Charter shattered this precedent completely. It fundamentally altered human history by firmly introducing the concept of individual criminal responsibility for violations of international law.
They essentially said, we don't care what uniform you wear or what your title is. You are a human being who made a choice. And to prosecute them, the Charter defined 3 entirely new, revolutionary categories of international crime.
Yes. Article 6 of the Charter established the jurisdiction of the tribunal. First, it defined crimes against peace, which meant the planning, preparation, initiation, or waging of a war of aggression.
Second, war crimes, which covered violations of the traditional laws or customs of war, things like the murder or ill treatment of prisoners of war or the plunder of public property.
And third, the most unprecedented category, crimes against humanity,
which covered the unthinkable: murder, extermination, enslavement, deportation, and the persecution of civilian populations on political, racial, or religious grounds.
And crucially, the Charter also established the charge of conspiracy to commit any of these crimes, meaning you didn't have to be the guard pulling the trigger. If you sat in an office in Berlin and planned the logistics of the trains, you were equally guilty of the murder.
And Articles 7 and 8 explicitly stripped away the shield. They stated clearly that holding the official position of a head of state or claiming you were just following superior orders did not free you from responsibility. It might be considered in mitigating a sentence, but it was not a defense.
The machinery of the state could no longer protect you.
The stage was set. The drama of the courtroom, which ran from November 1945 to October 1946, was unprecedented in human history. You had 21 major surviving Nazi leaders sitting in the dock. You had Hermann Goering, the arrogant, morphine-addicted head of the Luftwaffe.
You had Julius Streicher, the propagandist who had made Nuremberg his base. And you had Albert Speer, the architect who had designed the very rally grounds that glorified the regime.
One of the most powerful, brilliant, tactical decisions of the trial was the evidence used. Robert H. Jackson and the prosecution team didn't just rely on the testimony of survivors because they knew the defense would just accuse the witnesses of lying or exaggerating for revenge.
Instead, they relied heavily on the Nazis' own meticulous, obsessive bureaucratic documentation. They brought in literal tons of captured memos, train schedules, and execution orders signed by the men sitting in the room. They hoisted the Nazis by their own petard.
And beyond the paper, they used the most modern technology available, film. In a truly breathtaking moment of the trial, they dimmed the lights in the court committee, set up a screen, and screened raw, unedited Allied military footage of the liberation of the concentration camps, Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen.
It was horrifying.
They showed the bulldozers pushing mountains of emaciated corpses into mass graves. They showed the ovens.
The impact on the courtroom was devastating. Many of the defendants refused to look. Others wept or claimed they had no idea. But the symbolism was profound. A decade earlier in this exact city, Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will had used the medium of film to project a false, hypnotic reality of glorious, sanitized, invincible power.
Now, in that same city, the Allies used Fen to pierce that delusion and expose the grimmest, most undeniable, horrifying truth of where that power ultimately led to industrialized mass murder.
The trial ground on for nearly a year. On October 1st, 1946, the International Military Tribunal delivered its verdicts. 12 of the defendants were sentenced to death by hanging. 3 were given life imprisonment, 4 received shorter prison terms.
And 3 were acquitted, which surprisingly lent a great deal of credibility to the process, proving it wasn't just a rubber-stamped kangaroo court.
And the IMT was just the beginning. The United States subsequently held 12 more trials in that same Nuremberg courthouse over the next 3 years. They tried the doctors who performed horrific medical experiments, the judges who had corrupted the legal system to serve the party, the industrialists who used slave labor, and the leaders of the mobile killing squads, the Einsatzgruppen.
They systematically exposed how the atrocity had infected every single layer of German society.
If we pull back and look at this entire story, if we connect this immense, heavy legal legacy back to Act II, back to the Renaissance and Albrecht Durer, we see a profound, almost poetic closing of the historical circle.
It is the ultimate resurrection of the individual. Think about what the rallies tried to do. Goebbels wanted to turn men into a collective mass, a dragon. The Nuremberg trials effectively halted that dragon.
They ripped the individual out of the collective mass. The defendants were no longer allowed to be faceless cogs in an unstoppable fascist machine. They were put on the stand, illuminated by the harsh light of justice as autonomous human beings possessing free will and agency. And they were held individually, personally accountable for the choices they made.
It's the total rejection of the fascist philosophy. It says, no, you are not a drop in an ocean of blood. You are a person, and you must answer for your actions.
Exactly. And the legal principles forged in that courtroom, now known globally as the Nuremberg Principles, did not just end the Nazi era, they birthed a new era. They became the absolute bedrock of modern international law.
The precedent set in Nuremberg led directly to the United Nations Genocide Convention. They inspired the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and they laid the essential legal groundwork for the modern international criminal court that operates today in The Hague.
The radical idea that absolutely no individual is above the law, no matter how powerful their rank or their nation, was permanently codified in the city of Nuremberg.
So to wrap up this incredibly deep, intense journey for you, the listener, to walk through the streets of Nuremberg today is to walk a very delicate, almost dizzying tightrope of human history. The layers are all stacked on top of each other.
It's a heavy place to stand.
You are treading the exact same cobblestone market squares where Albrecht Durer patiently observed the natural world, carving individual genius into copper plates. You are walking the same streets where Emperor Charles V celebrated the Golden Bowl and the Imperial Regalia was paraded in glory.
And you are standing on the very same dirt where millions of people surrendered their minds to blindly salute a dictator, and where the architects of that terror were finally methodically brought to justice.
It is a city that carries the full, unbearable weight of human capability. It showcases both our capacity for incredible soaring enlightenment and our capacity for unfathomable mechanized darkness. And how the city physically chooses to handle this immense tension today leaves us with a profound final thought.
Yes, the architecture of memory. In the 1990s, the modern city of Nuremberg had to make a difficult decision. They had to decide what to do with the monumental, unfinished Nazi Congress Hall that still sat on the old rally grounds.
It is a massive, horseshoe-shaped brick building, originally designed to look like the Colosseum in Rome. Some citizens naturally wanted to dynamite it, to tear it down and completely erase the traumatic memory from the landscape. But the city chose a very different, much braver path.
They decided to turn it into a documentation center, a museum, to explain the origins of the terror. But they didn't just put displays inside the old rooms. They held an international architectural design competition, and they chose a radical design by an Austrian architect named Günther Dominic.
Dominic refused to respect the fascist architecture. He didn't smooth over the past. He designed a massive 130-meter-long corridor made entirely of sharp glass and cold steel. And he drove this structure, which is literally referred to as the stake, diagonally right through the massive brick torso of the Nazi building.
If you see it, it is a violent, intentional architectural disruption. It violently pierces the rigid, oppressive, symmetrical fascist geometry with transparent, asymmetrical, modern materials. It doesn't hide the building, it deliberately breaks it. It leaves a massive physical scar on the landscape.
It's like a glass spear thrown through the heart of the Third Reich.
And by leaving that stake in the heart of the building, it asks you, the visitor, to consider a question that extends far beyond the borders of Nuremberg. Can a society ever truly heal from its darkest, most shameful past by bulldozing it and trying to erase the memory? Or is it far better and far more honest to drive a stake through it, leaving the wound visible and bleeding as a permanent, undeniable warning to the future?
It makes you wonder what kind of history we are building and what kind of legacy we are leaving on the ground beneath our own feet right now.